Thank you to everyone for joining us today. Good evening, good morning. My name is Robin, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar, 4 Steps to Elevate Your North American Trade and Site Strategy. In the spring of 2020, Global Location Strategies and Prudenza Consulting Services formalized a professional partnership to provide site selection and advisory services at the North American level. Prudenza and GLS have a combined 85 years of experience helping companies establish sustainable facilities in prosperous communities all over the world, especially in North America. In 2019 alone, both companies directed $12.9 billion in capital investment to North America, bringing over 14,000 employment opportunities to the region.
I'm going to start this presentation by mentioning the 4 steps that we need to know that we suggest to elevate the North America trade and site strategy. And I think we will, of course, go through all of these steps by each one of them in a much detailed manner. But I just wanted to provide what we're going to talk about and just mention that we're going to go from the general perspective to a very particular perspective. So the first step is determine the drivers that are unique to your project. The second step is to collect the data about the locations under consideration. The third one is to analyze the data to determine the best location for further consideration. And the last one is to test these assumptions. So we're going to go, as I mentioned, from the general part to the particular one, and I'm going to start talking about trade, the North American trade, and of course the USMCA and how this is going to affect this strategy and this site selection. So if we can go to the next step, is the first one, determine the drivers, determine how this is going to be unique to your project, and taking in consideration these 3 factors: international trade, the USMCA considerations, and the primary project drivers. So starting with international trade, I think we can talk a lot about it. I'm just going to focus on how this the 2020 year is going to affect trade in a long term, and how this is going to be, of course, a drastic turning point in a lot of things that we need to consider when thinking about this strategy and thinking about this site selection. As we all know, the pandemic has accelerated this decrease on slowing down international and global trade. As we know, the first quarter had been a little bit in decrease in 2020. The first quarter had a decrease of 5%, but after, of course, the second quarter, when the pandemic started growing and spreading through around the world, this completely collapsed. And we are thinking that we don't have the real figure yet, but UNCTAD thinks that it is going to be a decrease of 27% or even more. So now we're going to talk about the regional trade, especially, of course, North America, and how NAFTA had been especially a tool of growth for the region. It is very important to know that the trade between Mexico, US, and Canada has summed more than 1.3 trillion a year. And these are figures from 2 years, 3 years ago. So right now it should be much more. 3.6 billion a year reflected in a major share production network. The US with Canada and Mexico trade more than all the European Union, over 2 times more than with China. We know that over 12 million jobs are supported by trade between these countries and investment also within our neighbors. And 50% of North America trade is intermediate goods, but we are not counting, of course, services, which have been increased in the last years spectacularly. $514 billion as a foreign direct investment in Canada and Mexico only. So that give us a great understanding on how investment between our countries is working, and also that, as I mentioned, is not only between our countries but also other countries participating in this foreign direct investment can affect your strategy for site location. Free trade agreement, it has been only in force for 2 months, but we already know what it stands by and what are the benefits that we can have from it. So basically, and this is in a very general manner, the most important part of NAFTA, and take it into consideration, but also build upon it and have more ambitious disciplines and preserve and protect the free trade. And that's what it does. Also, it provides certainty and trade to investments, as the NAFTA used to did, and it strengthens, of course, North America competitiveness. So basically, all these principles are very important because NAFTA had them, but this is something that the USMCA took them and improved them, basically. And it also added this modernization part. It transformed the old disciplines that NAFTA used to have, and it modernized them. It includes international trade rules recognized by all countries, but also it goes beyond the multilateral trade system. It is more ambitious, and it provides more a vision of a long term, as NAFTA used to do in early 90s. So right now, for example, NAFTA, USMCA includes disciplines that they didn't used to exist. For example, I'm going to talk about this in a little bit further, but for example, e-commerce, telecom, and all these new aspects of trade that were not even considered 20 years ago, now they are incorporated into the USMCA. So what exactly changed between NAFTA and the USMCA? Well, as I just mentioned, it modernizes the agreement, including these new disciplines, new chapters. It has 12 new chapters overall in regards to, in comparison to NAFTA. It includes digital trade, telecommunications, but also other kind of disciplines that didn't used to be in a free trade agreement, like anti-corruption, for example. This is something that if Canada and Mexico had accepted these proposals, that it would have been a more restrictive trade, and that's what we didn't want to have. We have an agreement, again, on the controversial issues, such as the sunset clause, more strengthening of the rules of origin, for example, and eliminating the dispute settlement mechanism that we didn't want to do that. So we had an agreement on these issues. And then we were able to have an inclusive and responsible free trade agreement in terms of adding chapters that are in accordance with protection of the rights of workers, for example, environmental issues, and also more, including SMEs, for example. We had a chapter that includes these kind of groups that before they were not included in free trade agreements. And it also has some gender provisions. All these changes, how they are going to affect the companies, or what do you need to know about this in applying or selecting a site? I think this is one of the most important slides. First of all, you need to reevaluate your supply base. We know that right now, with all these changes that have been going on through the COVID pandemic, it's very important to take into consideration all these aspects that affect your decisions in your supply chain. So one of them is, especially as I was mentioning, the region will become more competitive, but also countries are tending to have a more protectionist view. Not only because of the pandemic, we have seen it in other countries, and even before it, we have seen it for example, in the U.S. As a way to protect the industries and to protect workers. And every country may have its reason, but the truth is that protectionist is now a tendency that we need to consider. So regions and trade is going to be more focused, perhaps in the future, not more in a region based more than it used to be globally. Now, because of the pandemic and because of this trend, we need to reevaluate our supply base, and that is part of this new global chain reaction, that now we need to have our suppliers close to us, right? So this is part of the consideration that you need to have. Other thing is compliance with the free trade agreement, especially the USMCA, of course, in all these matters. Labor regulations, for example, rules of origins, and other chapters that are horizontally that affects all sectors, and that perhaps we don't know about them, and we don't know not only compliance or what we need to accomplish with this free trade with these chapters, but we need to understand also the benefits that some chapters may have or will provide to us, to companies. Specifically, there are like sectorial annexes, for example, that will apply to pharmaceuticals, medical devices, cosmetics, and other areas that perhaps companies do not know about. So it's very important, depending on the sector you're in, to just take a look at the different chapters of the USMCA and see if there's anything that you can benefit from. Another thing is to evaluate other risks. I think it's very important. What this pandemic has taught us is that there are other risks associated to these kind of considerations, and one of it is the health risk. We need to take more into consideration, not only because it affects our production, it affects our workers, it affects everybody. So we now understand that this might not be the only one, the only pandemic we're going to be facing. Perhaps in the future, we don't know still if there's going to be a vaccine or a cure. So this is something that every company needs to consider now in this process. Also, local suppliers are having more opportunities. They have, as I was mentioning, you need to have your suppliers close to you. So in order to follow or to continue with this trend, and in order to grow and in order to be part of the game, this is something that new companies will have to look at. And finally, localization is the new globalization. Is the same thing as I was mentioning. Depending on where you are, the regions are going to determine how trade is going to behave and how things are going to happen, right? So the regional trade and having your suppliers close to you is going to be the new normal.
Thank you very much, Monica. That was very enlightening. And I think that the last thing that you said there, which localization is the new globalization, is something that we're definitely seeing our clients from around the world start to talk about, which is more of serving your customers from a regional standpoint. So having an Asian supply chain, an American supply chain, and a supply chain that's more centered around Europe, possibly serving Africa from that region as well. I wanted to talk a little bit about primary drivers. So before you can determine what is the best location for your particular operation, you need to determine the drivers that are most important to your operation. And there's usually no more than 5. And you can list those in terms of how close do you need to be to either your suppliers or your customers? How important is labor to your operation, both in terms of availability, the skills, the cost? Is your operation very energy intensive? There are big discrepancies between prices, even within, certainly within North America, but even within countries, there are big differences between the prices of energy in one location versus another. And the regulatory environment. That can also impact how quickly you can get up and running. Some places it is a relatively quick process to receive your permits to start moving forward, and sometimes that takes a much longer time period. And then taxation and how it specifically impacts your operation. So the question that I would say is, where is your operation on the capital or labor intensive continuum? So I like to think of this as $1 million per job invested. So if you look at that $1 million per job created, that is sort of the threshold between a capital investment, a capital intensive project, and a labor intensive project. So if you are investing more than $1 million per job created, then that would be considered capital intensive. So an example might be $300 million invested for 75 jobs. These tend to be jobs that are in the process industry, so it might be chemicals or composites, metal refining, metal processing, biotech and pharma. Those tend to be very capital intensive projects. And if that is the case, then your typical drivers are going to be energy cost and infrastructure and permitting. And the reason permitting is so important is because in these process-related industries, the permitting timelines tend to be much longer. If, however, if you can hit one more click, you are less than $1 million per job created, then you tend to be more on the labor-intensive side. An example of those would be $100 million invested for 200 jobs. We did a project with a Belgian bus manufacturer, Van Hool. They located in Morristown, Tennessee, and they were investing about $50 million in creating 600 jobs. So that was very labor intensive. So the typical drivers for that type of project are large quantities of low cost labor. And I don't necessarily mean cheap labor. I just mean labor that for the same skill level is less expensive in one area than it is in another. And then also speed to market. So these tend to have less exotic requirements when it comes to utilities or transportation infrastructure. So the sites that can accommodate these types of projects are much more plentiful. So the sites need to be ready to go. Any of these projects, whether they be capital intensive or labor intensive, can be driven by the need for labor quality and availability, and also logistics cost and timing. So you may have just-in-time requirements. So even if you are a labor-intensive project, maybe serving an automotive OEM, you're still going to have logistics drivers associated with that. On the other hand, Van Hool is a really good example of where they had, because they were only making 400 buses per year, their logistics requirements were not that intensive, and the finished good, which is a bus, rolls out of there under its own power. So logistics was not a very important aspect, but that's going to be unique to your specific project. So essentially, any project that you are considering, you're going to want to find the location that has the best combination of 3 factors. And those 3 factors are the highest quality, the lowest cost, and the least risk. Now, some quality, cost, and risk factors are location independent. So you have market risk, you have the cost of your equipment, You have your the cost of some of your supplies that are going to be independent of where you locate. But there are some things that are very specific to that location. So the job of a site selection consultant, of your role as trying to make these decisions, is try to figure out where is the location that optimizes on both quality, cost, and risk. And what you really want to find is a place where those intersect, and that's the middle of those three intersecting circles. But oftentimes you have to make trade-offs. So a methodology that helps you understand those trade-offs can be very helpful. One of the things that you'll want to do is you're going to want to figure out what are the criteria that are most important to you from a quality standpoint. And that's going to greatly depend on whether or not you are labor intensive, capital intensive, or somewhere in between. So for example, we see that labor accounts for 30% of the qualitative score in the labor intensive example, but on a capital intensive example, it might only account for 15%. On the other hand, energy and access to reliable quality energy accounts for about 30% in a capital intensive example and only about 15% in an energy in a labor intensive example. So these are going to be very specific to your project. Once you determine what those major drivers are and how important they are relative to one another, then you can gather information about specific sites and score those sites to see how they relate to one another based on your specific criteria. Cost is another thing. So on the left, we have a labor-intensive example, and on the right, we have a capital-intensive example. So here you can see that labor, represented in the dark blue on the left-hand side, accounts for the vast majority of the labor-intensive or the location-dependent cost, operating cost. On the right-hand side, you can see that energy, made up of electricity and natural gas in the gray and the yellow, represent much more, so about 50% of the total location-dependent cost. So it really just depends on where you are on that spectrum, and depending on what your drivers are, the optimal location for you is going to change based on those criteria. One of the things I want to point out here is that on the left-hand side, under the labor-intensive example, you see the orange bars that are down below the columns. Those represent the incentives that might be available for that particular project based on location. And what I want to point out here is that incentives can be an important part of the process, but they're typically going to separate the top 2 or 3 locations. They're not necessarily going to make they never will make a bad location good. They can only make a good location better. So usually at the beginning of the process, incentives should not be considered too heavily in where you're going to place your facility. So now I'm going to turn it over to Sarah White, and she's going to talk about collecting the data about the locations that are under consideration.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dee Dee, for that. So really, step 2 is after you define those primary drivers for your project. So now you actually have to collect some data regarding those drivers. So during this step, I'll provide some examples of the data that we evaluate. Again, this is just a snapshot of some of the data that we look at, and also kind of talk about how you have to narrow down data looking at different levels throughout the site selection process. So on the next slide, I have an example case study here. This is just an example project gray, just a general manufacturing. This would fall more into that labor intensive project based on kind of those general metrics that Dee Dee explained there. So looking at 200 employees, capital investment of about 150 million. So really it has a lot of those same project drivers that we discussed on the previous step, but really that access to the skilled workers and that availability of the workforce is going to be key for this project. Logistics would also be important, as well as reliable and low cost electricity, but really that labor is kind of that key point for this project. So on the next slide, you can see I've talked, and I'll kind of thread this through as an example on some of these data points that we've outlined for you. So on the data gathering, there are a number of data sources available out there. So it's important to try to find reliable and consistent data sources when you're doing your analysis. So this can sometimes be difficult when looking at different geographies across the world, the data that's available, but we really look at a lot of different sources. And so there's really some primary data. Credenza is fortunate to have the operations where they manage over 50 manufacturing operations in Mexico, 2 in the US. So they have some of that firsthand data from their day-to-day operations. Additionally, when we look at communities, we also talk to other existing employers in the area to understand how is it to do business in that community? What is the general business climate like? In addition to the primary data tools, there are a lot of secondary data available there. And so these data sources are advantageous for evaluating labor and workforce characteristics, infrastructure that may be available, also the physical attributes of regions and properties specifically, as well as general business climate. Many of these secondary data sources are subscriptions that we pay for in order to have robust and accurate data. So it's more cost efficient for our firms as consultants to have subscriptions since we work multiple projects versus a company that may be doing their own site selection for one site selection project and may have limited resources. So again, we're able to look at all of these different tools, and they really help us navigate a lot more easily than some of those free data sources that can be a little bit more cumbersome to navigate on your own. But really, the data gathering, there are numerous sources, but it's really looking at trying to find consistent data to be able to look at multiple locations. On the next slide, I'm just kind of showing here that for Project Gray, you would really look at different locations. So starting there with the whole continent, and then you would narrow down to a state within one of these, or a state or a province. Then you can narrow down to a county, and eventually a specific site and location there. So if you could click through there, I believe I have some animation there on the different maps. So really, again, just starting with that broader level of review and then narrowing your way down. You can click again. Here we go. And then one more. So again, when you think about the data at the beginning in step 1, we showed that funnel where you're starting with a broader search region. It may be the continent, then you're getting down the country and states there as well. So there are lots of possibilities, and you'll be gathering the data for the different levels as you go through. So I'll provide some examples of some of the data that you may include in your analysis. And again, remember that this is not all encompassing, just some examples that may be used during site selection. So the first example I have on the next slide is the population density. So for this map, the darker areas show the areas that have higher population concentrations in North America. So you see in the US, there's more of a concentration in the metropolitan areas located in the Northeast and on the West Coast. Most of Canada's population lives within 100 miles of its southern border with the United States. Mexico has more density near Mexico City and those surrounding areas as well. Just one thing to keep in mind, that North America is much less densely populated than where you may be accustomed to. So again, something to think about, particularly for this one, for Project Gray, they would be wanting to be in areas where they could find the number of workers that they need, that available skill force. So this is something that they would maybe look at on that particular project. The next slide is shows the employment by industry. So this is more of a general manufacturing concentration or total here for the various states and provinces in North America. So we often look at employment by industry since there may be some synergies locating in an area that has similar supply chain, labor characteristics, and things that may be good. Now, there's also sensitivity to being located next to competitors sometimes, but again, sometimes these areas may be advantageous for the projects. And this is a general manufacturing, but depending on the industry that your project is in, it may be down to a specific NAICS code, which that's the North American Industry Classification System. So with that, there's different codes for different industries, and you can really look at examining some of the total employment for those specific industries for your project. So on this map, the darker areas indicate the areas with higher employment and manufacturing. So California appears to be the darkest there with the most, but that's a very populated state. So there's other areas that may be favorable as well. So looking at Project Gray, they may be interested in areas from looking at just this one data point, California, Texas, and the Greater Lakes. The Great Lakes region, but it's important to understand that you need to look at several data points and not just one. So the next slide indicates more of a concentration in manufacturing. So this is what we refer to as the location quotient. So location quotient looks at the concentration of an industry in an area compared to a larger area. So many times this is compared to a national average. So it may be a state compared to, or a county or a metropolitan area compared to, is that area more concentrated for a specific manufacturing industry versus the national average. So for this example, we actually looked at the whole North American location quotient there to see where there's a concentration of manufacturing there. So you can really see there, when you look at the concentration, that those border states and Mexico next to the US is much more concentrated than the rest of North America. Again, it's important to look at multiple different data points because a location quotient can get skewed if there's one large employer in a low population area. So again, it's important to look at multiple data points and not just one to kind of get a comprehensive view of where there may be some areas of matching workforce and different synergies for your specific project. So looking at this data point, Project Gray may be wanting to look at some of those Mexican states there where there's more of a concentration. There's other darker blue areas as well in other states that could be advantageous as well. The next slide, this is kind of a high level look of average industrial electricity rates. As Mexico has one provider, so that average is the same across those multiple states. In this case, the map, the darker area is the more costly electric rate. So this is where California, that's Alaska up there, that is darker and kind of faded out with the picture there. Those would be less favorable for Project Gray because they have higher electricity rates. This is one of the factors, and I'll talk a little bit more on data variability, but this can really sway different areas. Specifically, I know in the US, one site may be served by one electric provider, and the site across the street could be a different one depending on the territory. So this is just a very high level view at potential electricity rates, but that's something that you would want to dig into more detail as you move into more specific locations. The next slide shows just kind of a snapshot table of some wage rates. So wages, you can look at NAICS codes for the various industries, and then you can look within occupation codes there. So this is just a comparison of two different states, but wages, again, are something that can vary greatly across different jurisdictions. And so you really want to dig into more details surrounding wages and benefits, particularly if it is a multinational search, since countries' policies can vary greatly. Also, I know within the US, even states can vary greatly. So, for example, Mexico typically bills about 45 hours in a work week versus the US with 40 hours. So again, those other differences in benefits, Social Security, all of that would come into play. So again, this is a snapshot of wages, but wage data can get more accurate, the further detailed you draw in on your location. So the next slide is really just, again, talking about narrowing your focus. So we started with the whole North America. We're looking at different countries within there. Now you're looking at the state of Texas for this example. And so this takes that general manufacturing employment and kind of highlights areas that may be advantageous. And this is at the county level here. So some of those dark blue counties are really around some of those metropolitan areas where there's more population and employment in general manufacturing. So looking at this data point, within Texas, Project Gray may want to focus on the Dallas area or Houston, Amarillo, some of those. But, one thing I would point out as you're narrowing your search, you want to make sure that you do not narrow down too quickly using some of this broad data. Casting a wider search than just one state or province can really provide more property and incentive opportunities there. There's competition there for incentives and different things. And again, some of that data, again, is higher level. So you want to make sure you're not making cuts and eliminating down to certain locations on very broad data. So again, looking at the different things, you're going to be narrowing your focus as you move through the process and getting down to a more comprehensive view of more specific locations. On the next slide, it really shows kind of, again, this is an example of that data variability that it really, some of those key factors such as workforce, labor, utility, and real estate, those cost and quality can vary drastically even within a smaller search region or search geography. So for this example, that shows those pins represent 3 different properties within the Dallas, Texas metropolitan area. And when we look at workforce and labor, we look at commuting patterns. And so each of those colored areas show a 30-minute drive time from those specific locations. So if Project Gray is looking at these 3 different sites within that metropolitan area, looking at location 3, it may have the most population, but it does not have a concentration of that manufacturing employment. That location is probably taking in more of the downtown, more urban area, less of that manufacturing environment. So even within these different areas, and the lease rates and things for the real estate would vary greatly as well. So again, you start at that broad level and you get down to more specific information, but just remember that even within a metropolitan or smaller area, some of these factors can vary greatly. So that was a few examples of some of the higher points that we look at. There's a lot more. You can go back to the next slide. There are a lot of data, other data points to also consider. So again, starting at that broader data search from the continent and then really getting down to specific locations and sites there. Other things that you would want to look at are, again, digging in on the real estate, natural disaster risk. All of those things can really factor into your location. But that was just a sampling of some of that high level data that we may use to kind of help narrow down to key areas. So the next step on step 3 is really, so now you've gathered all of this information. Now it's time to analyze it and really compare the locations there. So again, you're narrowing down your focus as you move through. So on the next slide, you can see that this is more of where you do the data comparison. And so for the data comparison, we really typically recommend a weighted scoring approach. This way you can weight the factors on the level of impact they'll have on your project success. So think back to step 1 where Dee Dee was talking about the primary project drivers and those pie charts with the different weights of what was important for the labor intensive example versus that capital intensive. So this is where you can weight those different factors and data points that correlate with those different categories to really hone in on what's important for your project. Using a scoring methodology allows the process to have less bias and more transparency. So it really gives you and your company more of a defendable site location decision because you have these scores and different data points to back up your decision on that. Our team, we've really developed tools such as our benchmarking application that allows us to score a multitude of data points from everything on those workforce characteristics down to site characteristics, all of that very quickly. And so you can actually benchmark the locations from that more general location, maybe as different regions or states at the beginning of the process. And you can also benchmark as you move through down to specific properties because location A, that site's going to have different efficiencies and different strengths compared to another one. So again, there is no perfect site, but that benchmarking really allows you to see which trade-offs you'll have in one location versus another. So on the next slide, looking at that comparative analysis, so this is where some of that benchmarking, some of those factors are really coming into that qualitative scores. So that's where we do the scores and we're scoring them on those different project driving categories there. So that's kind of that chart on the left. So that includes, again, workforce characteristics, logistical synergies, things like that. While the qualitative factors are important, it is also key to compare the cost factors at one location. At the end of the day, a location must make financial sense. So you may have a great location from qualitative factors or great workforce, but it also needs to make sense from a financial standpoint. Risk is that the third bubble that was on that earlier slide that could also be layered in on this comparison. So the ideal location would be one that scores well on both those qualitative factors as well as having a low cost on that. So the next slide shows how we layer that on what we call our composite model. So this is where you really look at the qualitative scores and the cost as well. So using the methodology here, the upper right quadrant, that kind of blue square, would be those areas that score the best on there. So there's no perfect location, but this would be areas that could be more of a focus. So for Project Gray, they would want to look at these regions and these locations and that focus on them on that area to maybe go into specific locations and get further detail. The composite model is really a powerful tool that can be surprising for some clients that come in with preconceived notions of what is the best location. Once they see that data and really overlay, there may be one location that's great from a low cost standpoint, but maybe the qualitative factors aren't well. So this is just a really powerful tool that you can use to really hone in on your project specific needs and see how the different locations compare to one another. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Zoo to explain step 4 and testing your assumptions.
Thank you, Sarah. And I hope our audience, the attention span keeps strong. I will make it precise. So Sarah and Didi has walked us through the whole process of site strategy and in defining your drivers, collecting the data, and analyzing the data. So I'm going to share with you the last step, test your assumptions. Will be location search, properties, incentive, exchange rate, and the rural region. And next slide. So Sarah and Didi both mentioned about the labor intensive and then capital incentive. Here, mainly we are talking about the real estate. So usually when the site strategy, you go with the wild, narrow down to a city, and then you start with the real estate options. So usually when it's labor intensive, you focus first on the communities, the labor force, and the capital intensive, you focus more on the real estate site that has energy, cost, and infrastructure for your operation. So here, the real estate usually project is either greenfield or want to have an existing building. When we're looking at the land, it's important to know because there's a lot green land that the zoning, the land use, the development limitations, like such as wetland, environmental concerns. But when it comes to an existing building, you need to consider if it's a standalone building or inside the industrial park. When it's inside the industrial park, usually it's well developed, so you don't have to concern about the zoning land use issue. However, need to concern if you want to buy or lease, or down the road you want to buy, because there's a lot of options. They are owned by investment funds, so they are not available to sell. So that's something to consider. And of course, the building need to meet your production requirements, such as utility and specifications. But the one thing it's really important is the access to labor, because maybe down the road in the operation, you'll realize that make a lot of difference, because the turnover rate or the difficult to find people. So that needs something to consider, even it's not real estate. And when testing incentives, as Didi mentioned, the incentive is not a real driver. So here I would just want to share a case when especially the project compare different countries or different states. We had a client got really generous package of $11 million incentive for 10 years in Texas. But I just here give some example, different states and one state in Mexico. As you can see, some states have state tax and some state has property tax. And a lot of time our client ask us, like when they compare US, Mexico, they were like, can Mexico give the same incentive package? Usually not, because Mexico doesn't have state tax and property tax. A lot incentive package, of course, include way more, but a lot of times covers the property tax or state tax rebate. So that's something to consider when you compare different country or different state. And also can consider some other trade tax measures to reduce the operation cost, such as FTZ in United States, which not only help in the duty and property tax in some cases, and in IMAX program in Mexico, which is really common used for foreign companies in Mexico. And the exchange rate. From that table, you can see mainly it's when you compare in different countries, right? Here you can see as Mexican peso with US dollar, the fluctuation is really high, and the US dollar with Canadian dollar, it's quite stable. And the next slide will give you an example. Next slide, here's the example, the minimum daily wage. As you can see in Mexico, the dollarized daily wage in the past 20 years, almost with no increase because pesos depreciated a lot. And in 2019, come back a little bit, but 2020, it's come down again. So that's really something to consider while you are evaluating your project. So even though the rural region, it's not site selection topic, however, now with the USMCA and a lot of new investment, before the investment have to consider the rural region or how to attain the country or region when you come to invest. So here I share some basic rules of rural region. For the 4 basic rules, the first 2, it's easy because if you buy everything within the Northern America region or you produce from the scratch in North America, for sure you can get country region of North America. The third is a lot when foreign investment come to this site because they have to bring a lot of parts from foreign country. So that's when you need to analyze your product meets Annex 4B product specific rural region, which means HTS code. So your different product has different requirement. And then if that one doesn't meet, there's another option that meet in general industry, meet the 50% on net cost method when it comes to regional value content. As we know, the biggest change in USMCA's rural region is the automotive sector. So maybe you already know that. For the regional value content for the light vehicle has increased to 75%, and for heavy vehicle increased to 70%, all by net cost method, even though there is a transitional period that can gradually meet the requirement. And next slide. And here are the outer parts. The core parts, it's need to meet 75%, such as engine, transmission, the body frame. Those need to meet 75% on the net cost method. And the main parts need to meet 70%, complementary parts 65%. Another thing really important is steel, aluminum for production. The vehicle must to come from the Northern America region in a level at least 70%. So that's a lot car companies are considering that. The last point is the labor value content. 40% for light vehicles and 45% for pickups must corresponding to salary greater than $16 per hour. Here, I'm just giving you some real case, because for a lot of our automotive clients, such as BMW, we started a country origin analysis for his whole supply chain when USMCA was negotiating. So here is the one case is for automotive parts, which is quite simple. It's only a few parts. What we discuss with the client is which process need to bring to this North America in order, or what part need to be sourced in North America in order to meet, in their case, the 70% regional content value, regional value content. And the right side of the one is general industry. In that case, the product has over 200 parts. So the analysis, what we do with the client is the HS code, we need to classify each part, and according to their product specific rule or region, we needed to know what parts they can import and what part they must source in North America or produce in North America. Also, we will analyze all the duties for the import and find the duty reduction program. So that's really important you do before investment. So you know what process need to be set, and also your facility size and everything will depend your process, right? So that is now is commonly used by our clients when before the investment. And here's the summary what we discussed in the whole presentation. First, define your project's primary drivers and revisit them often throughout the process to ensure you meet your goals, especially what's your want, what's your must of the project. And second, gather data on factors that impact your new location success. There's a lot of data out there, so get the accuracy of data, it's really important. And third, develop an unbiased assessment by examining the data throughout the precision modeling and build a right cost model for your investment. The last point is we know quantitative analysis is easy to do, but you also need to have a good understanding of qualitative factors, which can have significant impact on your future operation.